All right. Welcome to the show, everybody. We have Wes joining us. I did just get a notification that Rumble might be having some problems getting the stream, but I think we're definitely live on YouTube. We're definitely live on uh, X, which I always want to say Twitter. But welcome to the show, man. How are you?
I'm doing well. Obviously, I am not there in person with you this time, which I know is different for you. But look, I got my protein shake ready to go. I got like 7 pages of notes. I'm geared up and ready for this podcast.
Perfect, man. Well, I appreciate you joining us. To the people as they trickle in, this is our first live show ever. Thank you for the people that are swinging by, the people that are going to listen to this on the podcast later. Wes and I have known each other for, man, probably about 2 years now. We connected over our love for Pistons basketball and turned out into just a cool friendship that we talk about anything from sports to politics to economics. And what I wanted to do today is something kind of special where there are obviously a massive election happening in our country right now. Everyone has their biases, everyone has their favorite person that they want to win. I'm obviously a conservative. I have my favorite person that I want to win. But I thought it'd be fun to actually jump into ask someone different that knows more than me on the economics of what's going on. So I just asked Wes to kind of give us a overview of Trump's plan versus Kamala's plan. What is actually on the agenda? What are they planning to do? I know Kamala has recently said her plan, and it doesn't have maybe as much, but we'll go through that. So, Wes, I appreciate you coming on, man. Thank you for doing this kind of like last minute. I think I texted you last week. I appreciate you doing that. Yeah, this is going to be awesome.
Yeah, I'm excited. Thanks for thinking of me to come on and just kind of talk some economics, which I always love to do. And actually, it's really funny that you mentioned that Harris kind of developed the plan later on. She absolutely did. She hasn't been talking about it out on the stump all that often until more recently. But what was really interesting was, in order to be fair, right? I'm really trying to just take what is published and what is given from both of these candidates. Kamala Harris has 81 pages of a detailed PDF outlining all of the steps, the things that she's advancing in her economic plan. And Donald Trump, at least on his website, the official campaign website, it just links to the Republican platform, which is only 16 pages and has a lot less detail. Now, obviously, at this point, Trump is a little bit of a more known commodity. I suspect that's where that's coming from. But in order to be fair to both, because Trump has said things that's not in this 16-page PDF. Harris has said things that is not in that 81-page note. For example, she talked about really going after price gouging very early on in her campaign. She walked that back publicly. It is in the PDF. So I am leaving it in my review of her economic plan for that reason, right? But I only bring that up to say, to be completely open, honest, and fair with both, I'm only discussing what they've published and what they've basically advertised as their economic plans at this point. And funny enough, Harris is a lot more detailed, which I would not have guessed.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're going to have a lot more sound bites of Trump talking about what he wants to do than Harris will. But as far as actually published papers, Harris has more, which is very interesting. So, Wes, who would you like to start with? How would you like to do this? I'll kind of give this up to you. I know you have a review of both economic plans, and I'm just going to kind of leave the floor open for you.
Well, I kind of wanted to spin it, actually. I was going to ask you where you wanted to start. But before we did that, I had really two very general takeaways from both of theirs. These were both things that I thought were actually problems with both of the economic plans. So we can just start off with a very simple one. Both Trump and Harris seem to want to pick winners as the government. And what I mean by that is, so for example, Kamala Harris's plan talks about subsidizing certain startups in a few different industry sectors. One of them shipping, another one's education, like childcare, things like that. It's very, very difficult for the government to actually give money to companies that are going to be successful eventually. You'd have to know ahead of time if those companies will be successful. Otherwise, you run a lot of risk as the government, as a taxpayer that's funding it. And then Trump does want to do a very similar thing. His, though, is more through tariffs, which just by definition are going to shift production to American manufacturing, for example, instead of foreign manufacturing. Again, we're running into the same problem of potentially malinvestment and kind of funky market signals that could get wires crossed within production processes, which I and many other economists would not be a fan of. So that was something that was oddly consistent between the both of them. And then the other one was just government debt. Neither of these plans will in any way address the government debt. Now, government debt and debt servicing in particular has been a larger and very quickly growing portion of the federal budget, which only means that the federal government is spending more of its revenue budget to pay off past debts. You're a conservative, so am I correct in saying that you are also not a fan of a growing government debt bill, correct?
You are correct. You are very
Okay,
correct.
good, good. All right, so I'll just take like 2 minutes then to explain the economics behind why you're absolutely right in that opinion. It's basically a snowball. Okay, so if you keep kicking that can down the road, it just gets larger, it picks up steam. You're paying interest on all of these essentially bonds that are sold out to individuals. Those are, from the government's perspective, loans that they're getting from the American people. The only way those loans are valuable is if they're repaid in real terms. Now, what we mean by that in economics is we mean that they track with inflation. So if I were to give you a loan and inflation outpaces my return on the other end of that loan, I really don't want to give you another loan now after this, right? So in order for those bonds to keep being a viable source of government revenue, they need to be repaid in the future at an amount that is equal to the total of the bond plus whatever inflation change. Because the bond is basically advertised as, look, you're not going to make a ton of money off of it, but it's stable and it's going to be consistent and reliable no matter what. So if it's suddenly not, that's a big problem. The other end of it is if the government raises the budget, they can't get enough from their bond financing and they don't want to raise taxes because politicians are obviously adverse to raising taxes. Nobody really likes that. If a politician goes out and says, I want to raise your taxes, you generally aren't going to vote for them. So politicians in Congress, they don't like raising taxes in general. That leaves it over to the Federal Reserve, the central bank. What they could do is print more money to pay off the debt, but that raises inflation, which also makes
That's what we've been doing.
Current bonds that are in circulation. Yeah, that is what they've been doing. And
I
the
mean,
trick
ever
with
since
that too is
COVID.
that's what makes current bonds more difficult to pay in the future. Right now, the inflation is going up. I'm going to have to pay a percent more on those current bonds than I otherwise would have if I had not done the printing. So, yeah, there's just no winning unless you generate more revenue and cut back on spending for the government budget. But yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
So let's talk about taxes. I think a lot of the people that are going to be voting are wondering what's happening to me. I know that
Yep.
very common in the leftist space is we're going to tax the rich to give to the poor, and a common thing that Kamala has said is that Trump is going to raise taxes for middle class families. That is what she said repeatedly. Is that true? Is Trump's economic plan that you found to raise taxes on the middle class family? And is Kamala's plan to tax people that make over 400,000? That was a question that CNN asked her just the other day, and she didn't answer the question. I mean, she didn't actually answer any questions, but in that specific question, she didn't answer. So when it comes to taxes, based on your review of these plans, I guess I'll just ask the first question: is on Trump's plan, is the taxes going to go up if we vote for Trump?
Not income taxes, or at least not what I saw. There wasn't anything specifically saying that any tax bracket will be paying more. I recently saw a study, I think it just got published yesterday, that talked about how each of their individual plans would affect lower, middle, and upper income bracket individuals. I have to assume that this is a continuation of Trump's previous tax policies when he was president before, as well as what he had done or what he has said out on the stump while he's campaigning. I did not analyze those things, so I did not see anything that was saying, middle and upper class voters are going to end up paying more in taxes.
What about
Similar, actually, oddly enough. So there wasn't anything, or at least that I can recall, that put out a hard line. So you mentioned, 400,000 or above. I didn't see anything on that, but there was quite a lot of language on billionaires, millionaires, quote unquote, paying their fair share, which, look, it's a very popular point of view, but I don't even need you to take out a calculator for this. There are not enough billionaires and millionaires to fund the government. There are not enough billionaires and millionaires to account for a tax cut to lower and middle class individuals. There are so many more poor and middle class people than there are extremely rich people. So you can't actually balance those scales without basically you just can't actually is the correct answer. You cannot balance the scales. Yeah.
The majority of people are poor to middle class that will be voting in this election, which is why economics matter, because we're feeling the pinch. We're feeling the economic pinch, the inflation pinch, the cost of goods. So if let's just say we take everything socioeconomically out, so we take a lot of the things that I'm personally passionate about and we're like economics only. I know personally, for me, when Trump was in office, things were way better. Now, you can argue what the left would say is that is a bleed through from the Obama administration. See, look, the Obama, that's what they say. And then look at the mess that Biden had. Trump left them a mess, blah, blah, blah. But all I do know is those 4 years that Trump was here, things were good. Costs were low. I seem to have way more money in my bank account. And I think there's a lot of people like me that feel like when Trump was in office, we had more money in our bank accounts. When Biden was in office, we had no money in our bank accounts. Is that economic policy? Was that policies that Biden put in place? Was that just solely a result of COVID and them printing money and they knew that was going to happen? And which of these two candidates are going to have a better economic policy for people like me, for people in the chat, that if we vote their direction based on your research, which it really has the poor and middle class more in mind?
I'll answer the first one first. So just in short, what happened on the tail end of Trump's presidency and then the very early days of the Biden administration, it is very much related to COVID. So not only was this partially a product of the Federal Reserve very quickly increasing the amount of currency out in the market, which raises inflation, this is also partially a product of both Trump and Biden sending out those checks basically to every individual bank account. I think they were $1,500 or $2,000, something like that. Those weren't income. So the reason they did that, they were hoping that people would take that money and then use it to purchase things. But what actually happened was people took that money, said, wow, what a gift, and put it in their bank accounts for saving, because that's not income. Most people only spend their income. They don't spend their savings, specifically on consumption items like grocery store, things like that. So that did not work. That was part of it as well. You also had the PPP loans going out to businesses, very, very similar function. So COVID, not the virus, but the federal response to the virus really did a number on the federal budget and on inflation. And when you talk about prices being lower in 2018, let's say, the reason they were lower is because your dollar was more valuable. So again, the reason it felt like the money in your bank account went farther in 2018 than now is because it did, not necessarily because of literal pricing, but because the actual unit of currency was proportionally more valuable then than it is now, and that's a product of printing. That's a product of the central bank trying to inject the market with more cash to try and boost consumption, which we didn't see actually happen. It didn't work. So, yeah, that's not a fun answer because it wasn't Trump's policies either. If you want to go back a little further than that, what he did in the lumber industry was an issue.
Right. I'm more concerned about moving forward. We know that there's a problem with inflation. We all feel it. What I think we all want to know is whose policy is going to help us get out of this. Did either candidate give us an actual answer on what they want to do? Or are we just kind of like, we just kind of have to go based off of what some of the things they've said and what they've been in office and proof?
So from my perspective, I think a good place to start there is just quite literally on why printing causes more inflation. So inflation as a theoretical concept, it is the devaluation of a unit of currency, okay? The way that we track that is by measuring prices. We measure aggregate or average prices through the CPI, which is a like 80,000 unit basket of goods. It's really a massive data set, what have you. So that's what inflation is. That's why it's important, right? But I think because of that, we see some misconceptions in both of these plans. So if you really want inflation to go down, what we need is the government debt to decrease so that the government does not feel the need to either sell more bonds, which kick that can down the road, or ask the Fed to print more money to finance their debt, right? We essentially need a period of time where revenue is ahead of expenses at the federal government level. Kamala Harris's plan focuses on prices. Okay, she focuses a lot of verbiage on trying to make sure prices are down in housing, at the grocery stores. She's advances trying to crack down on like the supply chain industry, for example, and subsidize new entrants into that, which has some issues, which we can talk about if you want. On the other side, Trump's plan is far more focused on government spending, which is great, but there's no revenue offset for that. So in the Republican Party platform, they mentioned quite a few times, we're going to cut programs, we're going to cut spending, and that is really great. They don't specify which things they're cutting. And on top of that, they also advanced cutting some taxes as well, just like Harris's campaign. But you need the cut of spending to be much larger than the cut of taxes in order to actually see the inflationary benefit, because the inflation problem is not government spending, it's what government spending without offsetting with more revenue is requiring the government to do. It's requiring more bond sales, which only makes further future expensive more expenses. It's requiring more printing,
I mean,
because otherwise you default.
They're delaying
Yeah,
the inevitable at that point.
exactly. And neither of these plans is going to address that, at least as far as I saw.
I have one comment to make on that. Somebody did ask in the chat a little bit ago, and I want to answer their question. They said, would it be possible to go back to a gold standard, or would it make sense to turn to a digital currency like a crypto? Because I know this guy.
No, not really.
No to both.
It's
so there's two questions there. There's the gold standard, and so talk about the gold standard. Like, is that possible to go back to where like the value of gold is tied to the value of the dollar?
Well, I think practically at this point we're a little too far gone. That's not necessarily a problem. Right now, what we're dealing with is fiat currency, which oddly enough is not all that different, at least from my perspective, than like a nationalized cryptocurrency, especially with how everything's tied virtual these days with your bank account. There's not too much that's all different, at least from our economic perspective of it. The gold standard was more effective at curtailing inflation, not because the money was tied to the value of gold that was actually in the reserve, but because it was a hard limit on the actual value of money that could be out in the market at a given period of time, if that little nuanced difference makes sense. So there actually is a positive demand for currency in the US and across the world right now because the economy is growing. There is a demand for more value. And that is why we almost always see a positive rate of printing. And a small positive rate of printing is not a bad thing. That's actually what you want. There's money exiting the system because it gets lost for whatever reason. And then, like I said, there's a positive demand for money. There is firm and consumer demand for more, which is good. And that demand isn't just that we want more cash, it's that we need more value. So to go back to the gold standard, it would put a cap on that. And at least in my opinion, you'd find those that would disagree. But I think that cap might be a little bit more detrimental than helpful at this point. As for a digital currency, I mean, I don't really want to nationalize crypto at all at this point. So I kind of like that it's off doing its own thing. People who want to get invested in it do. It's kind of the Wild West. I love that about it. And I don't really want to change it.
Well, that could be a podcast for another time, diving into the pros and cons of a crypto, national currency. Well, hopefully that kind of answered your question, Andrew. I did want to mention this going back to the economic policy. Something that gets me very excited and it gets other people very not excited is that Trump has announced that if he wins the election, he is going to name Elon Musk Secretary of Cost Cutting. This is why it gets me excited, guys. And I'm not an economist. I am very stupid. So I am like, this sounds great to me because look at what Elon Musk did on Twitter. He bought Twitter. He goes in there and he says, you know what? We do not need 70 to 80% of our staff. He fires all of those staff. And guess what? X is healthier than it's ever been. They've talked about getting rid of the Department of Education. They've talked about doing other things. So this is my question to you, Wes. Between the two economic policies, this is how so far what we talked about is this. On one side, Trump is like, I want to cut costs and I'm going to put people in the place to actually cut programs and whatever. And maybe he's not gotten into details on what they're going to cut yet, but his plan is to cut cost. Kamala's plan is regulation. We are going to put price caps. We are going to have the good old Uncle Sam come in there and force companies to keep their prices down because we love you guys. Is that how, if we're just, I know there's so many nuances to this, Wes, but like if we were going to just like break it down to simply, one is more cost cutting, one is more government control. Is that a fair breakdown so far of the economic policies?
More or less, I think I would say that is fair. I do think that the Trump policy, or actually not specifically the Trump policy, but the Republican platform was what I read because that's what the website linked to. I would say that there is quite a bit of government involvement on, for example, the no taxes for tips thing is going to burden the IRS quite a bit more than it already is.
Is that
that was in there? Yeah, it really was in there. The trade restraints and restrictions that Trump is advancing and the Republican Party are advancing, that also does as well increase the scope of the government. I think you look at immigration as one of those things as well. Building a border wall, or at least reinforcing the border, that's obviously partially construction, but you're hiring more agents at the border. Deporting people is not inexpensive as well. So that, and I think there are things on Trump's side that do add to the federal government apparatus, though at the same time, there's quite a bit of that as well with Kamala Harris's plan, potentially even more, by definition more, because there were 81 pages of it versus only 16.
Yeah, that we all know that she wrote herself, definitely.
Oh, for sure.
Word for word. So let's talk about tariffs. Tariffs have been a big heated debate when it comes to Trump's specific thing. Can we talk about tariffs? What are your thoughts on the tariffs? Is that a good idea in your opinion? Is that what are the pros and cons of this? Yeah, let's talk about tariffs.
All right. Well, that's a fantastic question. I was very excited to dive into this with you. So I'm prepared. I'm ready. But Dillon, you have to understand, I teach a class. I'm an adjunct professor at a community college for macroeconomics, and I absolutely hate lecturing for long periods of time. So I don't really want to do that right now. What I instead would like to do is turn around and ask you a question. If you're selling something, I want to buy it for you. I'm telling you that in order for us to come to an agreement on that sale, we have to disagree about value. Why is that?
We have to disagree about value.
You and I have to disagree about the value of the thing that you are possessing and trying to sell in order for us to come to an agreement on price to buy it. Yeah, you're selling it.
I mean, like that's how you set price, right? I mean,
yeah.
Like that's the perceived. I mean, I guess I know my profit margin, right, in some capacity, and you don't. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Well, we could simplify it down even further, right? In order for you to sell me the good, you value my money more than the good in your possession. In order for me to buy the good from you, I value your good more than the money I'm paying you for it. So this difference here, this is what we're talking about in economics when like you draw those supply and demand graphs, you see consumer and producer surpluses. That is that anytime there is an exchange, anytime there is a trade, both parties think that they won because both parties valued the thing they got more than the thing they gave up, right? So we can kind of expand that, right? So if we're looking at on a national scale, the US, for the most part, is not literally negotiating import and export agreements. What's happening is that goods are being imported and being purchased by US firms. So those US firms that are purchasing the imported goods, they're agreeing on a price. They think that the good that they're getting for the price is more valuable than the price they paid, vice versa for the other side, right? Flip it as well. US firms that are exporting goods are selling it for a price because they value that cash more so than the good that they are selling. Everyone's getting the most amount of possible value generation, value creation here that there could be. Everyone is essentially maximizing that out. Now, if, we talked about like price caps earlier, right? If we're negotiating a deal and there's a government price cap, say for $35, even if we still are able to agree on a price, the government essentially ate into one of our surpluses. That's either on your end or on mine, but essentially that surplus is cut off. And as well, if you're looking at a much broader scope of things, if you're looking at a market entirely, there are people that wouldn't have been willing to pay that 35, but maybe they would have paid 25 and they could have found a deal. So the loss there in value, now we're again, if you were on the supply and demand graph, there's a little triangle. We call that dead weight loss. That's value that could have been created, could have been generated, but wasn't. So the problem with tariffs is that they're essentially a tax. That tax gets passed on to whoever's buying the thing, all right, whoever's buying the good. So not only does it raise that price of the good for the consumer, but it eats into our surplus. We are actively harming US-based producers and consumers by instituting these tariffs. And then on the other end, if, say, China were practicing unfair trade and we were practicing fair trade, this is an argument that I hear quite a bit, right? They're getting more, I guess, margin on these trades that are being made, on their imports, on their exports, than we are. So we need to institute some tariffs to make it more fair. But the problem is that once you understand some of this Econ 101 stuff, you understand that China's actually hurting themselves. So the analogy I like to make is if you and I were in a boxing match and I saw you cut off your right arm before the match, my response isn't, hey, no fair, now I need to cut off my arm too. Like, we're not competing in hurting each other at the moment. Right. That would be silly. That would just be silly to do. So just because another country's doing it doesn't mean that we should. What's that?
So what's the purpose? What are they saying is the reason that they want to do these tariffs?
So Trump and the Republican Party are essentially, it's a similar argument that's being made for Kamala Harris and the Democrats on taxing billionaires and millionaires more. They're essentially saying, hey, we can lower your income taxes. We're going to institute these tariffs, and the tariffs are going to more than make up for the revenue lost to the government. The problem with that in particular is just that tariffs have a negative effect on the buy and sell of those imports and exports. So it's kind of a bell curve on the revenue chart, if you can imagine. When you start with the tariff and it's very small, it's positive, it reaches kind of a point of no return then, where our returns start being negative and they drop back off. So you can't actually fund everything through tariffs.
So in a way, we might see a little break on our taxes, we might see certain things, but we're going to see cost of goods go up as a result.
Correct. Yeah, cost of goods will go up. And I think that there's a pretty important human side of this as well, to be honest. So it bothers me a little bit when economists do what I just did right there. So the whole argument for free trade is that we're going to maximize the surplus. All of that's true. Free trade keeps prices down. But there's also a resource allocation side of this that is really important for American labor, for example. So like, if you want to, we could take this out of trade for a minute. Let's look at green subsidies. The government, through the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, a couple of years ago, what they ended up doing was sending a ton of money to EV manufacturers. That's all well and good if EVs are actually the car of the future. They might be, but they might not be. The problem is, if they aren't, then all of the individuals who got hired on these production lines for electric vehicles, The moment that subsidy's gone, so is their job.
Yeah, they're gone. Right.
Their job's gone because the industry would not have been succeeding on its
The industry
own.
did not dictate that growth. It was the
Right,
government.
exactly. The industry didn't dictate the growth. It was propped up by the government. And so what you have now is a group of people who, yeah, for a period of time, they had a manufacturing job, and that's great. They were earning income. But in the long run, what happened was their labor was essentially put to an industry that was on the downturn already, right? It would not have been there if not for this subsidy, and now they're jobless later on. So there's always this initial pain that I don't want to minimize. If we have a lot of free trade, essentially it means, again, going back to our value discussion, what we did earlier, if there is a demand for imports, it means that a foreign producer is relatively better at producing that good. That doesn't mean that like the quality's better, but maybe the quality for the price is better. Or maybe they're just able to do it more quickly than the American manufacturers are. Whatever the reason, if there's a demand for imports, it means that the American side of that
Yeah, there's a
manufacturing,
reason why.
yeah, it's on a downturn. And you
So
don't want to be forcing people into jobs in industries that aren't going to be around for very long, at least not at that size. And I think that that's really a bad thing.
is there any way though that this is more than just economics? There's also just a political side of things too, almost like showing China who's boss. A little bit of like you can't bully America around with is there any side of this that while it might not be ideal for some of the cost of the economy, is there a version of this where there could be political positives to this outside of the economy?
Well, I think narratively, protectionism is always really popular with American voters. That's been the case for a very, very long time. I mean, you could go back to the 70s and 80s and the big push to buy American-made vehicles, and there are still people like in Detroit, Michigan, that like absolutely will never buy a foreign car, even
Right.
though in many ways, or not in many ways, but in certain situations at certain price brackets, that's the better car. You should probably buy the foreign car.
Yeah.
So like internally, yeah, it's always going to be politically popular. I would say though, in terms of we gotta show China who's boss sort of idea, Milton Friedman has this great quote where he basically says that competing on tariffs is competition and masochism. Because look, if China's already instituting a tariff, like I said, they're harming themselves. They're not harming us. In fact, American producers are making more money off of the things they're exporting to China, because the things that they are exporting to China, they're having to pay a tax on. They're raising prices and kicking that over to the Chinese consumer. None of this feedback loop is coming back to the US at the moment. And in fact, the fact that the US is relatively more free in its trade practices means that all of the American citizens and the American firms are relatively better off than the Chinese counterparts. So again, to me, like it doesn't make all that much sense to say, hey, we need to show this guy who's boss, and we're going to do that by like slicing our wrists for no reason without being prompted. It's competition in self-injury, and I don't think that that's
Just doesn't make yeah,
yeah,
doesn't make
it
sense.
just really doesn't make much sense at all.
Well, then let's talk about I feel like everyone in this election is just like the lesser of two evils, right? A lot of people feel like
Yeah,
that. So let's talk about Kamala. We talked about a little bit about Trump's tariffs and about his idea of cutting costs, which I'm 100% behind. I might be in the minority in the chat. You guys can let me know, chat. Let me know. Um, do you like the idea of Trump appointing Elon Musk to the Secretary of Cost Cutting? Let me know if you like that idea. I personally, man, I mean, I think it'd be awesome, mainly because the left hates Elon so much that it would just be awesome to watch him wreak havoc. And I just don't think I can cut 30% of our government and we wouldn't even notice. Like there was a very funny meme, Wes, of like this government organization doing hurricane relief, and they had like, do you see that moving the log? And there were like 18 people doing like a assembly line going through,
I
and
didn't, but I
it
can
was
envision this.
it was like that is government efficiency if you've ever seen one, because it was hilarious. And so I personally am for that. As silly as that sounds, I'm like, why not? Personally,
I'll just say on this, the slightly libertarian side of me, absolutely. I have no opinion on Elon Musk, but the slightly libertarian side of me absolutely loves the idea of a government position just focused on cutting spending. That's just that's some Ron Swanson type stuff right there, and I quite like that.
absolutely. I mean, there's like I said, like everyone said that Twitter was going to fail. He fired 70% of the staff, and it's bigger than it's ever been. I can guarantee we're in the same spot with our government where you could get rid of, I bet you could get rid of, and I'm not talking about military, I'm talking about programs. You get rid of 70% of the government, and I bet we're going to be better off as a nation. Someone asked this in the chat. They said, how will either candidate's economic policy affect small businesses? And is there one that would be more advantageous for a small business owner?
It's a very good question. I would say so Kamala Harris's plan is the only one that talks about small businesses directly. I do think on the Trump side of things, most of the effect to small business would be on like if you do have potentially some sort of production process, or if you are engaged in an international sort of sale of something, that it'd be more of the tariff side of things. But Kamala Harris does have a section where she talks about basically cutting a bunch of red tape for starting a new small business. I think that is fantastic. That was one of the highlights of the actual plan. You had to go through quite a bit to get there, to be completely candid, but that was fantastic. On the other end, though, she did advance like subsidizing certain new entrants. So specifically for the shipping industry, for example, she wanted to essentially introduce more competition in shipping, which is just a gross misunderstanding of what happened during the COVID shipping crisis that we saw. And as well, again, now we're jumping into that government picking winners and losers thing that I alluded to. Effectively, what that's going to amount to is a bunch of rent seeking by small startup firms, which really isn't all that great. But in terms of the red tape, and I guess if you're a small business owner, even though I would, as an economist, rent seeking is terrible. I think that's an awful thing to me, but it does make sense for you as a business owner to pursue it. Kamala Harris's plan actually might be a little bit more immediately beneficial, not to cost, but just the opportunity to start stuff up.
Yeah, I know that there was a big thing with Kamala, and I don't know if this was in her economic plan, but it seemed like she was actually more interested in helping Black business owners than anyone else. Did she mention that in the plan at all, or is that just something that she was talking about? Because she had this very large interview where she was just everything about her economic plan for small businesses was helping exclusively minorities and having special plans for minority business owners. And it seemed like her, based on what she was saying, in between her cackles, was that she was more interested in helping minority small businesses than small businesses as a whole. Did you see that throughout the economic plan, or was that just more as her talking points, trying to gather votes?
Yeah, so it wasn't exclusive, or at least it was not in those 81 pages. There was quite a lot of language on how these plans, how these things like lowering red tape, for example, would help minority small business owners, but it wasn't presented exclusively in the way that this is geared towards helping minority small business owners. It seemed to be framed more as a, hey, this is something that'll just make it easier to start a business. And oh, by the way, if you happen to be a Black business owner, this will affect you positively as well. And then what I'd say to, I guess that quote that you're referencing, again, we're going into a little bit of that picking winners and losers thing. So if the government has to be subsidizing things, it should be subsidizing ideally things that are going to be successful and would have been successful anyway. If economists like myself were in any way proficient at beforehand selecting which new companies were going to be successful, I would be a very rich man right now, and I am not. So it's generally just not a great idea.
So if you had to summarize, we're going to get to more of a Q&A time here in a second, and I'm going to give you a little bit more opportunity to share something. Is there anything else that you thought would be really helpful to throw on the episode? Because I'm going to be able to cut up this episode and release these clips and different things. Is there any specific parts of Trump's or Kamala's plan that you think are massively detrimental that we should know, or really good? is there anything on Trump's plan that you think is good? Is there anything on Kamala's that you think is good? And is there anything that we need to watch out for in either one of these candidates that we have not talked about already?
Great question. Two things come to mind. One is for both candidates. The other is just for Kamala Harris. So both candidates do spend a lot of time talking about housing, especially with first-time home buyers. And then Kamala Harris's price caps on things like pharmaceuticals and just general attacks on price gouging. I think both of those things are very important, but I'll leave it to you to pick out which we want to discuss here for the last little bit.
Well, let's quickly talk about price caps. If we can keep it to like 2 minutes, that'd be awesome. Generally,
Sure.
I'll kind of give a lead in for it. Generally, what I believe is the more government regulation is bad. The more big government that regulates things is
That's going to get you really far.
Yeah, I know, right? I'm super popular with that.
No, intellectually, that'll get you very far, actually.
Good.
That's a very good baseline.
Perfect. See, guys, I'm smart. But when we hear price caps, I know that we also hear a lot of big pharma actually just wrecking prices. Like there is an actual problem when it comes to insurance companies and big pharma. And so price caps on the surface level are like, well, that makes sense because big pharma is screwing us. So why wouldn't we want price caps?
Yeah.
And then on the flip side, generally government involvement is
Okay.
bad. It's not a good thing when government gets involved because there's a lot of snowball effects that will happen as a result. So, in your opinion, in just a few minutes, is it better that we don't put price caps on? And what other things could an economic plan do to help solve the issues of big pharma price gouging us? Because that is an actual problem. Or is it better to say sometimes it's not the ideal solution to price cap? We wish we didn't have to, but we'll do it this time.
Let's just start off with price gouging very quickly. I'll give some cliff notes on that. Essentially, if you're a business owner, your costs are not actually setting your price. That's part of it, but it's more of a red light, green light situation. So when a firm is setting a price, what the firm is doing is expressing what its expectation that of the price that consumers will pay for its good. The red light, green light now side of this is if my expectation is that I can make money doing that, being that the price I think consumers are willing to pay for this is above my costs, then I will go ahead and produce the good. If not, then I won't. So because the actual end price is not actually tied in that way to costs, it's not actually tied to profit margins per se. It's very subjective in that way. It's very arbitrary to set a percent margin that is now quote unquote gouging. So price gouging in and of itself, that's not actually an economic term, that's a legal one. In economics, we have surge pricing, which is a temporary increase to prices in times and periods of very short supply. That's only put in place to force some short-term rationing until more supply shows up. The assumption, of course, is that more supply shows up and prices do drop back down. This happens frequently in like disaster scenarios for water bottles, things like that. Not that that's popular, but that's generally a good thing. Price gouging is something entirely separate. The problem with price gouging is that, like I said, we can't actually identify when the price is quote unquote too high. It just kind of makes people feel good, and so they like to attack it. Apple, of course, gets massive margins on their iPhones. That's not price gouging. People would pay even more for some iPhones than they do now because that's the easily best-selling smartphone out there. So again, you can't just look at profit margin and say, oh, that's price gouging. There's also a little bit of a rent-seeking side of this. If you and I are competing and I don't like that you're making a higher margin than I am, I can call up the feds, say, hey, Dillon's price gouging, and now you're tied into a legal battle that's going to take you forever, and I'm going to make more cash. But that's price gouging. I was going to go to the other, but let you respond first.
Well, just really quick. I mean, I understand what you're saying with Apple, but do you think there needs to be a difference between when there's like, this person will die unless they get this drug versus they kind of want a new iPhone? Does that make sense? Because
yes,
there's a human element of life when it comes to price and profit margin. And then there's the one that's just kind of like, here's a electronic that I set my profit margin, and if you want to buy it, you can. And I feel like those aren't apples to apples.
No, they're not. They're not. And so let's talk about pharmaceuticals then, because that's directly to the point of this question. As an example, let's look at insulin. So the insulin market in the US, it is very restrictive to research and produce insulin. It's very costly to do. There are only actually 3 manufacturers in the US that are able to produce and are actually authorized to produce the insulin that people need to survive if you have diabetes. The problem there is naturally government created. Okay, if you roll some of those restrictions and protections back, you have more competition in the market. So, for example, if we remove some research regulations, make it easier for new companies to come in and research new ways to perhaps produce insulin or new ways to deliver insulin to the people that need it, that potentially could lower costs as well. For removing like patent protections that the current big 3 producers of insulin have, then that also allows for newer market entrants, more generics, things like that. The point is that the cost of insulin continuing to getting pressed so high before the price cap of $35 was instituted was actually government created. It wasn't something that was just naturally occurring. And then again, I'm going to bring up that rent seeking thing because, why was insulin capped at $35? It sounds good. We're going to lower that price, but why $35 specifically? It's arbitrary. There isn't an answer. There was no rhyme or reason to it outside of the 3 large manufacturers were comfortable with that $35 price. So, long story short, the moment that someone new can develop something to produce insulin more cheaply or sell insulin more cheaply and essentially undercut those big 3 producers, not only are they going to make a ton of money, right? Because everyone's going to be buying their insulin, but it's also going to incentivize more people to jump in as
But
well.
is that allowed the way it's set up right now?
No, not right now. And you see that across the pharmaceutical industry. So the pharmaceutical industry in particular, with its patent protection structure, it is just incredibly difficult to enter. And it's not a product of the industry itself. It's a product of how the industry is regulated. It's very costly
Is this
to
something a
participate.
presidential candidate could fix?
Not on their own. Most of this would be either just pure bureaucracy. So you'd be looking to yourself and looking to Congress to basically change appointees in some of these agencies, government agencies, and as well Congress rolling back some laws would be a good idea. So that's more congressional, but obviously a presidential candidate has a lot of sway, right? If Kamala Harris were to win and the Democrats were to get majority in the House, for example, she could pressure the House majority Democrats to push something like this through. Same vice versa, if Trump were to win, the exact same thing could happen. Neither of them are talking about doing it, but if either of them did, that'd be a really great thing.
Yeah, well, I know that Trump is also very tight with and planning to appoint RFK Jr. and RFK Jr. hates big pharma. So, in my opinion, I think that if there was a presidential candidate that would attack big pharma more, it probably would be Trump and RFK Jr. I'm not saying I'm a big fan with everything that RFK says and does, but I know that he is not a fan of big pharma, and he's not a
As
fan of.
long as the attack is removing regulations and
That's
restrictions,
what we
I'm
want.
all for it.
And I think, from what he said, I think more of what he is wanting. Let me just say a couple things from the chat. Amanda earlier said, "Yeah, I'm all for Elon." This is our conversation when it talks about being the secretary of cost cutting for Trump. She said, "Yeah, I'm all for Elon. He's been very successful. I think he'd probably do a good job." Amanda, I agree with you. I think Elon would do a great job. Andrew said, "You already know my thoughts on Elon." I do, and you're wrong. Elon is awesome. But then Andrew asked a good question. How are candidates held accountable to stay true to their campaign policies? And Justin responded to that in the chat by saying, sadly, after elected, nothing forces them to do what they say. I think we have seen constantly a lot of lying that does happen to get votes, to get in there. But I do want to park on that because I know we need to finish our previous conversation real fast. But are outside of getting reelected, is there anything that candidates, is there any way that we can hold candidates accountable to keep true to their campaign policies?
Don't underestimate that power of being reelected or not. Politicians' only concern on their day-to-day actions is trying to be reelected again in 2 or 4 years. So Y- yes, technically, there's nothing that's actually forcing them, right? There's no controls here. There's no regulation that's making sure that they actually do their campaign promises. But at the same time, if they get into office and do absolutely none of their campaign promises, they're going to be a very ineffective and very unpopular politician. They got into office saying X, Y, and Z. If they don't deliver on it, that's usually a problem for the voters, even in congressional elections where there is a very high premium to incumbency. So I would just say there's nothing, there's really no guardrails there, but that's maybe more of a feature, not so much a bug. Don't underestimate that effect. Politicians do absolutely care about being reelected. As an economist, I think it makes them do some really dumb things.
Yeah. Yeah, you see a lot of wishy-washy, flipping back and forth. But this is actually the importance of speaking out on your opinion. I can't tell you how important I really think that X has been in this election. There have been things that certain politicians have said, and then there's been a massive just backlash to their policy. And they're actually like, oh, I was just kidding, because people actually made their opinion known. So, Justin, I agree with you. Like, there are things that Biden said he was going to do that he did not do. There is actually things that Trump said that he was not able to get done in those 4 years. But I do think that being reelected is a very important part
It
of
is
the
a
pie.
powerful
And if
motivator.
they start getting wind that they are not going to get reelected because they are not fulfilling what they said, that's the importance of speaking out. That's the importance of being very vocal in your leaders. And this goes all the way down to local government, by the way. I have a buddy who's running for a couple districts in Ohio, and it is absolutely important all the way down to your local government, to the Senate, to the House, and all that stuff, to be very vocal with your leaders, because we kind of get mad at politicians for not having a backbone because they're just chasing votes. But in a way, that's kind of what we want. We want them to listen to what the people that they are representing, that what they are saying. We don't necessarily want a leader who has their plans and they ignore everyone else. And it's their plan. Their goal is to represent the people. So when I'm talking more about the representatives of your local government, the Senate, and the House, in some ways, it is a good thing that they do want to chase votes because they are representing the people that are voting for them. There are some things that obviously they need to have backbone on, and I don't want a complete wishy-washy person either. So I think both can be true at the same time. But let's finish the conversation really quick. And guys, keep chatting in the chat. Shout out to the 18 people. There have been 18 people on this the whole time. Kind of going to 17. We've been up to 17, 22 the whole time. So there's a bunch of people that aren't chatting in the chat, but have been watching. Thank you guys for watching this show. I told Wes before I would be shocked if we had one person. So the fact that we've had 17 people on the whole entire time, hopefully this is obviously it's been interesting because you've stayed. So thank you for staying. We've had a blast with you. We're almost done. We're probably going to stream for another 5 to 10 minutes. We're going to finish this thing and then just do a Q&A for everyone. So be thinking of your questions. We're going to do popcorn Q&A here in the next 3-4 minutes. This could be questions for me, my opinion. Who do you think is going to win, Dillon? What do you think is going to happen if Kamala wins? What do you think is going to happen if Trump wins? Dillon, who do you want to win? Wes, who do you want? We can have any in a second. It's not going to be economics related. It can be, but please start queuing your questions up in the chat that you want to ask us. And as we wrap up, I do want to finish our conversation of the pros and cons of each economic plan that we are kind of going through. So Wes, backtracking to when we were starting to talk about that. If you had to just give like a 30-second blurb for each candidate, what is Trump's strength that we should be excited about for his economic plan that you've been able to see? And then what are some potential downsides? And then same with Kamala's.
Yeah, well, I can start with Kamala Harris very easily. So, as the two main positives, shall we say, are the red tape for small business owners. That's great. Making it easier to start a new business is going to increase competition in markets. As an economist, I absolutely love that. And then, as well, occupational licensing reform. She's got a very small blurb in her plan about that, rolling back restrictive occupational licensing. And that is a wonderful thing. I don't have time to obviously get into it now, but the occupational licensing, it's actually more efficient cost-wise to have no licensing at all than to have an inefficient government licensor. So without 100% efficiency, we have a lot more costs, and those are a problem. The downsides are it's going to increase a lot of the scope of the government. It's going to play a lot of government picking winners, within industries, which is not great. And in no way is that going to help inflation or help the government budget. So I think those are the big risks on her end, and the two very solid positives. As for Trump, I think that the idea of cutting certain government programs, cutting back on regulations, for example, as well, those are great things. I really hope that he does that if he does win. But some negatives, actually, no tax on tips for both candidates. That's a negative. We don't need to get into all the nitty gritty as to why, but that's not fantastic, and that goes as a negative to both of them. Trump's not going to fix the inflation. He's not going to fix the government budget either. And I do think that tariffs are a very, very strong negative here that are just, it's unfortunately a very, very much so a feature of the entire program. At the end of the day, going through that 16-page PDF, I think it gets mentioned. Tariffs and immigration reforms to those two things get mentioned on almost every single page. So unfortunately, unfortunate for Trump that the decreases in regulation and government agency spendings are more than offset essentially by those negatives. And same for Kamala, those dropping back red tape, some occupational licensing reform. I'm a huge fan of those things. And then the rest of it is just not very good.
Perfect. Well, guys, you heard from Wes. Wes is, thank you, man. That was incredible. There's a couple questions in the chat that we're going to move towards. And I do think, guys, what I wanted to share just remind you guys of is this. The reason I love Wes is Wes does a really good job of being unbiased and looking the data for the data. And we talking specifically about economics. We're not talking about socioeconomics. We're not talking about how other things that really do matter when you vote. And there are, I think it's a very healthy thing to look at your candidate and say, this is not ideal. And you should be able to say, I wish this was different. And that's an okay thing to say. What actually pisses me off more than anything is when people say that they're unbiased and then they say the most biased thing possible. And so I wanted to have someone in here that at least does his best to look at the data, be unbiased with the data, and present the data. And now it's up to you guys to say what's more important to you. What do you think is helpful? So thank you, man. I really appreciate how you tackle this subject matter. And it's always really good and deep. And my brain is always spinning to just like follow, like, it's just so good. And you do a good job keeping it simple. So I appreciate that, man.
Thank you so much, man. I really appreciate it. That was very kind of you. So thank you.
You're welcome. Let's jump into the first question. Justin says, my question for both of you would be your thoughts after November 5th. How long do you think it will be until we get an answer on who won the presidency, with all the states not having the same due date for the ballots? I'll answer this first, and then Wes, you might be able to give you a chance as well. Arizona yesterday, the day before, said that it might take them up to 2 weeks to count all of the votes. In Michigan, Governor Whitmer a few weeks ago said that she would in no circumstances recount votes. So the answer to your question, Justin, is I have no idea. I think, in my personal opinion, I think we're going to get a result election night and going into the next morning. I think they're going to announce the winner. And I think both parties are going to raise hell trying to make sure that was the actual person, make sure all the votes are in. I think it might be up to 2 weeks because that is, from what I've heard, that's the longest state that said that there's going to be a recount. Do you have anything to add on that, Wes?
Yeah, I agree. It's not going to be on November 5th. In fact, I really, just personally, I wish that all the news shows and all the newspapers wouldn't call the election until at least maybe a week, maybe even 2 weeks, if Arizona's projection is correct, are actually passed. Look, we're not going to know. The problem is that there are quite a bit of mail-in ballots. A lot of them have already been submitted, but more than a few states actually have restrictions on how many mail-in ballots you can count beforehand. And just because of that, it's going to take some time to get everything kind of through the pipe, so to speak. So, yeah, we're not going to know right away. It'll probably take a couple of days. And just for the sake of not having chaos, I really wish that, CNN, Fox, CBS just didn't call it. Just leave it open, tell everyone we're not going to know until Sunday, and then just wait and see, because we're not going to know. We're not going to know.
Yeah, I think right now the answer is 2 weeks, because that is what we've been told is the longest state, at least announcing how long it's going to take. Why it takes so long, I have no idea why it will take so long.
It's
Um,
self-enforced. They're restricting themselves from counting a lot of these ballots, and it just gets messy. And it's all by hand, of course, too. It's
yeah,
people
it's a
don't. It's
mess.
messy.
Yeah, I got to ask this question on Twitter the other day: is do you think the left will cheat? And my short answer is I'm going to be shocked if both parties don't try to do whatever they take to get their candidate in. What I will say is the Democrats will do anything and everything from calling Trump Hitler to a fascist to get him out of office. So, do I think that there might be some weird things happening? I do, but I do think that's why it's important to go and vote, do your job, and we can ignore the whole economic thing as if your vote matters, Wes, from our conversation. Remember that earlier this year. But if you can't cheat the mass, and so if the mass moves, I don't think it's going to matter what party does what. Um, so Amanda asked this question: do you think that we've already had the October surprise, or it's coming still? I asked for some context, and she says, I believe the 2020 election was about a Biden laptop or something similar to that. Do you think that we have more surprises coming in the election season, Wes?
Man, I want to say no, but this has been a wild ride so far. I don't know why it wouldn't be any different over this next week and a half. A wild card, of course, is what's going on with Israel in the Middle East. If Netanyahu wants to fire some rockets somewhere else, declare war, I mean, that's a big surprise. That would be poor timing, I think, for Kamala Harris if that were to happen. Then, I mean, you could try to spin it. Maybe that's poor timing for Trump as well. But it feels narratively that may have more of an impact on her than on him. Just in terms of other things, it's a surprise. So I don't know what it could be outside of that. But I don't know. Maybe,
Yeah,
maybe.
I think you're going to see a lot of things that people try to make surprises that are not surprises. They try to turn them into stories that they're nothing. They're just full of hot air. You have one the other day that there's a video that said Trump groping a minor, and they tried to just say this random video that no one has and no one's found, and it was actually just a video of a kid Trump holding his own granddaughter and kissing her on the cheek. And so you're going to see these headlines that are just nasty headlines that are doing everything they can to just sway an uninformed voter. So, Amanda, to answer your question, I think there's going to be a lot of October surprises that people hope they hit that are going to be story spun way out of proportion. I hope there's nothing insane that just shatters American public even more than it already is. I think right now, the American public has a good idea on both candidates and both parties and what they represent. But do I think there's going to be another thing like the Biden laptop story, or back in 2016 that Russia was behind Trump and that kind of stuff? I don't see there be much more than has already been out there. I mean, you can only call someone Hitler only so many times before it just stops losing its ring. So I think they've tried everything. I think, honestly, if you ask me my opinion, Trump just needs to have the best security in the world for the next 2 weeks.
Uh,
That is my number one concern. I think the October surprise is that there is going to be another attempt, and that's the only thing they have left. And the reason I believe that is because Kamala Harris was 3 days ago, made a whole press conference, and she made the whole press conference on how Trump is Hitler and things he said that he wanted attorney generals. You don't say those types of things unless you're inciting violence, and I think that's what I'm most concerned about, is that over the next 2 weeks. Amanda said, yeah, I agree with you on that. I think the potential for war is definitely a possibility, and it wouldn't be too surprisingly honest on that point. I agree. I actually talked about this last night on the Conspiracy Pilled podcast. I think whoever wins on either side, there is going to be a lot of anger and resentment. I think the left has been characterized by groups like Antifa, groups like BLM. They do a
Real
lot
quick,
more.
Dillon, I think she's talking about the war in the Middle East with Israel and surrounding areas. You can continue on, but I wanted to throw that in.
Thank you. That's actually a good point. Well, I'll keep going with my thing. I think there's actually a big issue on either candidate here in the States. Yes, war. I will say if Trump gets reelected, I really do believe most wars will stop. I really do believe that. You can call me a Trumper, which I'm not. I'm just going back based off his track record, and his track record has been pretty dang good when it comes to wars. I think if Kamala gets elected, I think all hell's going to break loose. But that's just my own personal opinion. Wes, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm no political consultant, so I really don't have a great answer on that. But don't you also find it very interesting that Kamala Harris has gotten kind of hawkish on foreign policy? It's almost old school Republican-y. Like it reminds me a little of the John McCain type stuff. And that I like John McCain. I'm not trying to compare them any more than just that very specific thing. But I don't know, as a Democratic candidate for president who has more of a history of being a little more progressive than up the in the middle. That was surprising. I really did not see that coming. You could call that, I guess. When did she take over? Maybe that was like an August surprise.
Yeah, an August surprise, exactly. And yeah, you're right, Wes. Good catch. And the only reason that was in my head was just because of the conversation we had last night. I was posed a question by someone in the chat that said, "Are you concerned for like war here at home?" And I said, given just the pure hatred of Trump, it wouldn't shock me if you're living in a big city, you just got to be careful for a couple days. If Trump gets elected, just based on history. I mean, look at Seattle, look at Washington. I mean, it's just happened. And so, yeah, I just think it's a rough time, and I'm ready for election to be over. Personally, I'm ready for us to, whoever wins is going to win, and let's just get on with it. I talked to someone today. They said, I'm not losing any sleep, but I might be if Kamala wins. That's what someone told me. But until then, it's just like, let's just get it over with. Well, guys, thank you. Any other comments in the chat? And then Wes, any other things that you want to bring up before we end the show?
I do think it'd probably be good to bring up the housing thing. Both of them really focused a good section on trying to get housing prices down. Both were talking about tax credits and potentially support to first-time home buyers. So just like as a quick note on that, I want to flash everybody back to 2008, right after the bubble burst. Yeah, on the news we were seeing all of these videos of basically abandoned houses, right? Houses that they couldn't get sold and they just were bankrupt mortgages, and so they just were left there, and they were kind of left there to rot. And a lot of people, I think, kind of took that to think that, oh, there was an oversupply of houses at the time, and that's not true. Literally, there were not an oversupply of houses. There were still people that were not able to buy a house shortly before 2008. But I think more deeply, there's this idea that there's a national stock of houses, or that there's a national demand for houses, and that's just simply not true. Yes, in order to get prices down on houses, we need more construction companies to build more houses, but the type of houses really matters. And it doesn't matter in the way that you'll see Kamala Harris talk about it in her plan. She says we need more affordable housing, right? There's not actually a demand across the nation for affordable housing. There's a demand for more housing. There are local stocks of housing. So what matters is building the right house in the right area. What was happening in 2008 was money was very cheap. It was easy to come by loan-wise. It was very easy for individuals to buy, quote unquote, the wrong house, houses that were not actually, or would not have actually been valued in the area that they were in.
A lot of bad loans. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot of bad loans. It's houses that shouldn't have been built in that spot. So for example, if you want to build a super expensive house in North Dakota, go ahead. You're probably not going to get as much for that house as you would somewhere else. It's kind of a waste of resources. If you want to go to like the North Shore in Chicago and build a low-income housing unit, maybe, I mean, go ahead, but odds are pretty high someone's going to try and buy that plot of land, level all the actual wood, brick, and whatever you put into that house, and build something bigger because, well, that land was more valuable than the cheap house. The problem with the housing market right now is just that we don't have enough of the quote unquote right houses in the right areas. All that matters is local demand and local stock. There's not this national need for more cheap houses, more middle houses, more expensive houses. So if we want to recreate some of the sins of the past, we would go ahead and give that $25,000 credit to first-time home buyers. which makes money a lot easier to come by, and then makes investment in quote unquote wrong houses more easy. And I think that's just a bad path to go down. Trump loosely talks about the same sort of idea with tax credits and subsidies, as well as for some reason he says cracking down on immigration is going to lower prices on houses, which it won't. But regardless, I think both of these candidates have really kind of misunderstood what went wrong in '08
Yeah.
and why we are where we are right now.
I mean, guys,
That's an important point.
common rule of thumb is just government involvement is just never good. Let the market, I mean, like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if we just let the market take it, eventually those houses will be built in those right spots and good loans will be made. And if it's not forced, like, problems won't happen. It might be a little slower, but that's the idea of a free market, right? Is those things will happen over time.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that there's generally a role for government. Broadly speaking, there are things the government should do, such as like protect property rights. That's a pretty important thing. But yeah, in general, as like a very basic rule of thumb, lean more to decentralized action than more centralized action. Yeah, absolutely. I would say that that's right.
Well, perfect, man. Well, it sounds like I think the people in the chat, you at least my goal today was that you have at least an appreciation and an understanding more of both economic policies. I think at the end of the day, for me, if you're going to ask me my personal opinion, I'm more interested in cost cutting than regulation. And so whether or not we're going to figure out how that looks, I think the people that Trump surrounded himself with, I'm more a fan of than the people that Kamala has surrounded herself with. And so I do think that the cost cutting aspect of Trump's, I'm really excited about. I'm not thrilled about the tariffs. And then on Kamala's side, I'm just not thrilled on the constant regulation that's part of her plan. And she might have some good things in small businesses, which is awesome. And so, but it's up to you guys. It's up to you to figure out what you believe and what you think is the most helpful. Wes, is there something you were gonna? I know you were looking up something. So, if there's something you want to add there, real quick.
No, I was just making sure I didn't miss anything. I don't think I did. I hope I delivered, man. Thank you for having me on. I'm honored to be the first online guest of your podcast. I think this was really cool, and the chat feature was really great. So just thank you for having me on. I hope I delivered on actually reading all through all of the, I guess 97 cumulative pages of economic policy and giving a brief summary. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate it, man. And I'm telling you, there's just something good to even know more about your own candidate. Like, obviously, I'm planning to vote for Trump, and that's something that I don't love everything about Trump. I don't love anything about Kamala, and so that's a pretty simple thing for me. But even like knowing the downsides of your candidate is a very good thing to do. No one wants blind sheep voters, guys. Like, nobody wants the people that pretend your candidate is sent from heaven and perfect. So there's actually a good thing to be like, I actually have a problem with this. I wish my candidate wouldn't do this. That's a good thing to happen. That's how we learn. That's how we grow. So there's no problem to admit that your candidate is not perfect and doesn't have everything right, because that's just how we learn. And that's a good thing to admit. I think sometimes we get stuck in this like American politics where whoever you're at, the left will be like Kamala's plan is perfect and has no flaws. The right will say Trump's plan is perfect and has no flaws. And that's just not the reality we live in. The question is what in the grander scope of things is going to be most beneficial. There's going to be some hits. There's going to be some misses. So I appreciate you, man. This was really, really exciting. I do want to turn to the chat real quick, and everyone that's listening later. As you know, I've been doing the show for a little over a year now. We have not done any live, and I've been asked and been told that I really need to start a live show. I've been requested multiple times. Other podcast content creators have said, Dillon, if you start a live show, this will just be an absolute dynamic thing for you to do. So I'm planning it. I want it to happen. I don't know if it will happen, but I want you guys to let me know if the people that are, there's about 20 people still live with us. Thank you for being live. I think a weekly show. Let me give you guys the example. You can let me know in the chat. And if you're listening to the podcast, follow me on Twitter at Dillon M. England. On Twitter, you can let me know. DM me. My DMs are open. I deal with hate mail all the time on Twitter because my DMs are open. I've been called a fascist like 30 times this week. It's been super exciting. But let me know in the DMs if you think this would be a good idea for the show. But I have been wanting to start something called Here's the Dill. And we do a weekly show going through all of the current events in the world, whether that's politics, sports, comedy, whatever the exciting stories. And then we're going to have a section of like funny, uplifting, inspiring stories, probably somewhere from a 30 to an hour minute show. And also sprinkle in some guests like Wes, right? Like this was a little bit different of a conversation than maybe a normal, because I had already had him on the show. Normally my podcast is very much more like getting to know people and their story, whereas a live show could be more of like a 30-minute time slot mini interview with a guest, or having a guest on to react to current events with me. If you guys think that would be something that you'd enjoy watching, you think it'd be something that you'd like to tune in, let me know in the comments of this video as you guys rewatch it. Let me know, DM me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, whatever. As I produce this show, I want to come up with something that you guys would enjoy. And so please let me know as you watch it. I think it could be really fun. I just have to make sure I have the time and I can actually curate the content. But I really love the concept of getting some people on. Like I'm going to get Brandon Tatum back on the show, and he'll be able to just do a quick little 30-minute with me. I'll get, probably Kyle Mann, Joel Berry, Seth Dillon, Spencer Clavin, and doing some really fun things where I can maybe have guests come on for 15 to 30 minutes and then also do it to keep the podcast going on the side. So if that interests you, please let me know and give me ideas. If you have someone else that like you watch a certain show that you're like, I love this show, send it to me. I need your help. We're currently going through a rebrand, and it's super, super exciting. Last thing I'll leave all you guys with this December, official announcement. I'm going to be going to AmFest, which is the Turning Point event that Charlie Kirk runs in December in Arizona. It's going to be an opportunity for me to meet some of the world's top conservatives. I'm going to be on Media Row. The show is going to be represented. I'm going to be able to do live podcasts, live interviews with all of the speakers and people there. So super here, we're doing like a quick little round of applause for people. I don't know if you can hear it. There you go. And so that's going to be happening this December 18th through the 21st. I will be in Arizona. So if anyone that's listening to this will be in Arizona, please come and see me. But you're going to want to follow me on Twitter if you're currently not following me on Twitter, because that is where all of our live updates are going to be. Twitter moving forward is pretty much replacing Instagram for all of our announcements. Everything that you want to know about that, we're going to be doing live on our Twitter from that. So make sure you're following me on Twitter if you're currently not, because that's where all the live announcements are going to be. So please subscribe. We have very exciting things happening on this show. Wes, you are the guy that got to kind of cue this off. And considering we've had like 20 people on this whole time, I kind of feel like this is a massive success. I was thrilled that we've had the audience that we have. Did the people watching, please, I hope you enjoy it. And Wes, I'm going to give you an opportunity to give any final thoughts. Any plugs? What plugs do you have, brother?
Well, yeah, I don't have any final thoughts other than just, again, thank you. I thought this was a lot of fun. I like diving into stuff like this. So it was a great time for me. And I appreciate just the ask. Like you said, you asked me, I think it was last Saturday. So we didn't even have a week to plan this up. But it was a lot of fun. I think it worked really well. I think you should do that live show. I think a lot of people would like that. But in terms of plugs, yeah, you can follow me on Twitter. So if you want more basketball kind of Pistons stuff, that would be at the Real West D3. I host a podcast discussing Pistons basketball. NBA season just started up. I also produce a separate podcast as well. If you want more of the economic side of things, then econ_Davenport. That's where you could find me on Twitter. That's just the blog that I run called Davenport Economics. On top of that, I do have fairly exciting news. I do have a research paper that'll be published in the spring. It's going through peer review right now, but that paper will be published in the Journal for Law, Economics, and Policy. It's discussing some of the transaction costs of local zoning. If you're into very academic style research papers, then go ahead and give that a read when it does get published. If not, then I guess just give me a little pat on the back, because I'm kind of proud of that one.
Dude, congratulations on the paper. I will be putting on my Twitter links to all your stuff and also in the links of this video. So make sure you guys go to the description of this video. Follow Wes, read his paper if that interests you. If not, subscribe to his newsletter at Davenport Economics. He sends out pretty frequent newsletters on the state of the economy. Very interesting read, short, sweet, to the point. And so I'd recommend doing that as well. Well, guys, we're going to end the show Thank you guys, everyone, for coming by. Thank you for supporting the show. I really appreciate it. Before we leave, I got to shout out my sponsor, Cool Beans Coffee Brewery. I'm drinking it right now. Let's see if we can get it in focus. Aha. If you love coffee, you will love this blend. It's a low acid coffee blend called our broadcast brew. It's some of the best coffee I've ever had in the world. It's air roasted. It's delicious. And make sure you go to Google Cool Beans Coffee Brewery in Michigan. Go to their website, look for the broadcast brew. Every bag that's purchased supports the show. So if it's a win-win, you get to support the show and you get the best coffee in the world. So who wouldn't want to do that? And obviously, I got to pin him on his comment. It's so good. Yes, it is. All right, guys. Thank you all for coming back to the Dillon England show. We'll see you guys. Who knows? Maybe I'll live stream next week. Please follow me on Twitter. Let me know ideas for the show. Wes, thank you, brother. And we'll see you guys in the next one.